Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. I'm an anti-revisionist Marxist-Leninist who spent thousands of hours of my life studying political economy and the history of the international communist movement, and now I run a YouTube channel where I share many famous communist works as audiobooks with commentary and discussion. Today's July 2nd, 2025, and the other day I posted a video titled Thoughts on Zohran Mamdani, a communist point of view, stop pinning hopes on Democratic Party election wins. The thumbnail had a picture of Mamdani with the words reality check, and basically this was Marxist-Leninist commentary for US leftists on the possible meaning of the New York City mayoral campaign of DSA's Zohran Mamdani amid a stalled US-American class struggle. Overall, the video went over well with 12,000 views in a day and a half and 96.7% positive with 1,100 likes. So basically, I feel like people were receptive to the discussion that was going on, and there were a lot of pretty good comments. However, I wanted to make a follow-up to it because there were certain things in the comments that I saw repeatedly that I thought were potentially on the wrong track and at least needed further discussion or pushback, clarification, qualification, and that's what this video's for. So I do want to address some of those comments first, then we're going to look at a Mamdani video clip that he put out addressing his official victory after all of the votes were counted the other day. He officially beat Cuomo by over 10 points. 56 to 44, so 12 to be exact. And that clip contains a reference to what I think is the heart of the matter here, the running in the Democratic Party. And thirdly, we're going to look at an article from Lenin from 1901, which discusses some of the same points that we're talking about right now with this campaign. And specifically, that's the lack of Vanguard leadership in the US, without which these kind of mass rally fight back moments are just going to slip away into liberalism and not coalesce into a movement for socialism. So as far as the comments, there weren't too many heinously awful ones, but there was something that I kept seeing over and over again, kind of a flavor, that built up on me as I read dozen after dozen of these comments. And what was coming through there was this sort of unfounded hope that somehow, no matter what happens, it's just going to be a win. Whether he actually wins the general election or not, whether he's able to push forward his agenda or not, whether he eventually breaks with the Democratic Party or not, it's somehow okay because Overton window and reducing people's opposition to socialism, even though what he's talking about isn't socialism, it is social democracy, it's expanded public programs. And the reasons for this were varied, but a lot of them came back to, I believe that in his heart, he is a democratic socialist. Never mind the fact, as a lot of commenters even acknowledge, that democratic socialism doesn't work. There is not a peaceful parliamentary road to socialism, and even a cursory look at 20th century history can tell you that. For example, we have an audiobook on the channel from Hoja titled The Tragic Events in Chile from the 1970s about Allende in Chile, who was a democratic socialist, got elected, and then got assassinated and a fascist coup was installed with the help of the US to replace him. A lot of the argument being here that Allende's movement had not built up the revolutionary Marxist-Leninist on-the-ground organizing that you would need to resist the inevitable attempts at counter-revolution. Further adding to the tragedy was that the revisionist Communist Party of the Soviet Union at that time was holding this up as an example of the peaceful road which Lenin said was impossible, but which they had decided was now possible in the post-World War II environment. But it was not. But anyway, arguments that rely on reading intentions in that manner, like, oh, he's a good person, he is really a socialist in his heart of hearts. I mean, first of all, you don't know him. And when you hear the word politician, think actor seeking political power. It is literally his job to make you feel warm and fuzzy about what he stands for, and if that happened for you, it doesn't mean anything about his politics. It means that he was an effective actor and you were susceptible to the routine he was doing. Now, it doesn't mean that he's lying about anything in particular. It means that you're not approaching this with the bare minimum amount of skepticism that you need. As to the Overton window, or the window of political possibilities, this is an idea that was developed in the 1990s by a libertarian political theorist, and like the political compass, which is also a product of Lawbertarianism, it should be mocked and discarded. It just isn't a well-grounded piece of your political toolkit of understanding what is going on in society and how things change. Anyway, my main intention in making the video was to bring this discussion back down to earth, again to serve as a reality check, and while there were a lot of unqualifiedly good comments that I think got the message and stayed within those parameters, there were a lot of people who seemed to agree. They would indicate agreement of some kind, but then before signing off, they compulsively had to take a few more rips off of the hopium pipe. And we really need to break that habit, seriously. I know things are bad, and I know we really want an easier route to a solution, and we just are kind of desperate. But in the end, false hope is going to slow us down, not get us there sooner. I will read some of these comments just to illustrate what I'm talking about. I'm a communist. While I absolutely understand the theoretical limits of fighting for reforms within capitalism, and that we should be organizing to create a dual-power worker state, I really like Zohran Mamdani and what he represents. He represents a decisive shift in the Overton window and a stepping stone for more people to get involved in organizing for socialism proper. Time out. He is not talking about socialism proper. His campaign is not for socialism proper. So there are other steps in there. And it's the purpose of this video to highlight those gaps in the logic and what is it? What is the crucial missing ingredient that can actually realize these hopes and aspirations rather than having this movement just crumble back into liberalism and disillusionment? Continuing the comment, Zohran is not another Bernie. Bernie is undoubtedly a SOCDEM, but again, depending on where you look in Bernie's history, at times he was a socialist, or at least strongly appeared to be one. Used to work with Michael Parenti in a socialist party in Vermont. It wasn't until a couple decades later that he made his deal with the Democrats that he would be nominally independent while functionally a Democrat and wouldn't organize a third-party challenge to the Democrats, because that's really the thing that the Democrats are terrified of. And when we see somebody who claims to be a socialist working with the Democratic Party, you really got to stop and go, what is going on here? Continuing, Zohran actually does support socialism as we understand it. He even made a tweet some years back saying that the only way to make an economy that represents the people is if it is controlled by the working class in response to a Democratic Party tweet. So he knows, but he's not doing it. What's going on? For me, that is actually not evidence in the let's believe him column. It's more in the let's be skeptical column. Continuing, of course, the Democratic Party can't be rehabilitated, and I think the DSA should break off eventually. So here we have this kind of, again, I found this through a lot of comments. There's agreement. I know that we should do this, but let's not do it. And then a variety of bad explanations and excuses for why that's not being done. Such as, continuing the comment, but even Lenin said that using every tool at your disposal is important for growing class consciousness. Okay, yeah, we're going to continue to try to agitate, educate, and organize people, but correctly, for socialism, and against the Democratic Party, which is distinctly not Mamdani's message. Concluding the quote, if that can be directed away from capitalist politics and get people more familiar with socialism, I'm all for it. Okay, the counter to that for me, and this popped up a lot, was if we have people thinking socialism is more public programs, if we have people thinking that social democracy is socialism, that's actually a problem. Again, the key issue here is a lack of Vanguard leadership to direct this kind of mass activity in a revolutionary direction. I'm doing what I can with this YouTube channel, but I'm a little YouTube channel. There are various parties in the US calling themselves communist. They're also small, let alone the actual content of their politics and messaging. Alongside this, you have the open sewer pipe of channels like Hassan, who are muddying the water for people trying to understand what to do. As of this point in time, we communists collectively are trying to multiply and reproduce. We're trying to make more communists. And I'll even be charitable and extend that to even groups that I consider revisionist and opportunist, but who are at least studying some kind of Marxism-Leninism somewhat and are firmly opposed to liberalism, at least nominally. That's raises a lot of other issues, but let's be generous here. Even if you round all of us up, revisionists included, there just aren't enough of us to drown out those voices. So in the current moment, given that balance of power and influence, there's only so much we can do. And speaking for myself, I'm doing everything I can on a weekly basis to try to get this messaging out there and spread the education, but life moves pretty fast and the Democrats have a lot of money. Meanwhile, the Trump administration just passed a bill that will absolutely gut what's left of the social safety net, They're opening a concentration camp in Florida. They are trying to denaturalize people, including Mamdani. There's even been discussion of that, who posed the slightest inconvenience to far-right messaging, and the State Department is now even considering not issuing visas to people who have any sympathy or affiliation with international political parties that are socialist in any way. Meaning, time is of the essence, and we need to concentrate our limited resources on actually getting to the heart of the problem and using the methods prescribed by scientific socialism. In other words, we don't have time for the Socdem hopium. We never really did, but as it seems the US is on the brink of a major economic crash and seems to be preparing for war also, we especially don't have time now. And again, while the comments in isolation might not seem that bad, after you read comment after comment after comment like this, you see that there's kind of a cognitive dissonance. Remember I said, if he gets elected, I would expect disappointment, excuses, and mental gymnastics. Well, the mental gymnastics people are already stretching and doing their warm-up routine. Alright, next comment. I see it as a win-win scenario for agitation. If he's destroyed by the establishment before the general, we can point to this as proof that we can't even get less than the bare minimum reforms. But, time out. This presumes there is a we, loud enough, present enough to do this effectively. Now, I count myself among that we, and I presume that you count yourself among the we too. But let's be realistic about what we're facing. I don't think we have the people or the resources to get to it effectively, so what are we, in practical terms, looking at? We're going to catch as many people as we can off of this campaign, but we need a much bigger net. Please hear me on that and get it ready. As somebody on the front lines of the agitation and education, I'm telling you there just isn't enough right now. Continuing the comment, if he wins, he'll almost certainly not be able to deliver on his promises, or he'll become an overt defender of capital. In either case, this can also be used to prove again that reforms are not enough. True. But again, we are in a defensive posture here. In that scenario, we communists are trying to clean up the mess left by the Socdems, who are running a campaign in the Democratic Party, which doesn't need to be done. At what point do these campaigns just start being run correctly, with independent working class strategies being run from the outset, rather than us having to try to make the best of a bad situation after the fact? In other words, I think that a lot of these comments, a lot of this thinking, it's too slack. Tighten it up. You're acting like we have all the time in the world when that is rapidly proving itself not to be the case at all. Concluding the comment, I also see it as a good opportunity to educate average Americans on what socialism, Marxism, and communism actually are. Okay, but again, we could be doing that in tandem with better campaigns in the first place. And even though the MSM, mainstream media, capitalist media, lies about these terms, they are at least opening the discussion to the broader American populace. Again, I think that this is really stale. The 2008 economic crash almost 20 years ago did that. Occupy did that more than a decade ago. Bernie did that a decade ago. We really need to get more proactive, go on the offensive in terms of the messaging and outreach, because again, this situation is actually almost 20 years stale at this point. We need to stop tailing social democracy and really acting like it's such a benefit, it's such a win. That should be us up there, and we can make it happen. There is definitely work to be done, but we can make it happen. You have to believe that. Another comment, I think he'll serve as a Bernie for many people in that he'll demonstrate the Democratic Party's inability to move left. Do we need that demonstrated again at this point? Does anyone need that demonstrated? We need to go to the next step because we are done with this one. Continuing, of course, social democracy has the limitations it does, but I think his campaign is helping in breaking the unofficial religion of anti-communism in the United States. How? He is not a communist. They didn't say how he is doing that. Continuing, it may lead to people abandoning reformism. Again, if you don't want people just becoming disillusioned and becoming inactive, which, as I've said in the Bernie playlist multiple times, as well as in other videos, there tends to be two modes of the US left: trying to reform the Democratic Party, then giving up and doing nothing. So where do these people who have abandoned reformism end up? Demoralized and inactive. Furious at the Democratic Party, terrified of the Republican Party, and feeling like the left is too fringe to join and build up. For more discussion on that, see the Socialists Against Bernie Sanders playlist that I talked about in the last video, as well as the recent comments that I also linked in the last video. A tale of two comments, and more on US left parties, both from the last month. Again, if you want the people not to just fall back into inactivity, we need the Vanguard to emerge. I have been taking the strategy of trying to teach people directly, then sending them into their local activist circles to try to form things, because the parties that exist have not provided that leadership. At least not yet. Some of them are newer and on the way up. But some of the older ones, people have tried to reform and get back on a revolutionary path many times, and that has not really gone very far. While it's true that the United States is a very challenging, very adverse environment for organizing a communist group, we need to do more in this respect, including trying new strategies to build the Vanguard as needed, because it is a critical ingredient for building up a sustained mass movement for socialism. Continuing, although his aims of redirecting people into the Democratic Party are concerning, to say the least, I don't know if he'll be successful in that. So again, just to reframe this situation, rather than getting super excited about picking up the leftover scraps, the fallout from a social democratic campaign, whether it's successful or not, to opportunistically try to rehabilitate the Democratic Party, which is absolutely an explicitly stated goal of Mamdani himself, we absolutely have to use more of the tools at hand to run initiatives that are more in line with the principles of scientific socialism from the start. Yes, there are challenges, but the situation is already riper than many people are giving it credit for, and there are just chances not being taken. Whatever is there, we have to figure it out, and we have to work it as hard as we possibly can. Next comment, and this was in response to something I had written. Well, how about the 50,000 canvassers that helped the campaign and the people who joined and wanted to learn about socialism? And in response to that, it really depends on who is telling them what socialism is, what they're telling them, and how they're telling them to go about trying to attain it. Because if it's not a communist telling them what socialism is, they're going to be getting a wrong idea about socialism. That is confusing if they ever have to relearn it later. Basically, the fewer times somebody has to relearn something, the better. Concluding, I was able to talk to a ton of new canvassers and explain socialism and get them to join DSA. And again, that's only valuable insofar as there are communists in DSA, and those people are studying communism, which many people in DSA are not. When I send listeners of this channel into DSA, if they have nowhere else to go, they can't find another party that they want to join, I know that those people have probably read the basic Marxism-Leninism study guide, maybe they listen to the live streams, they have some kind of communist influence directly on them. Many do not. So again, this comes down to the role of a communist vanguard being able to direct people toward scientific socialism, Marxism, and not toward reformist social democracy. So again, I like the enthusiasm. As with all these comments, there's something positive there. But without the key ingredient of communist leadership, you're just making more liberals. Or at best, some kind of social democrat. And before you hit me with the, well, it's a step in the right direction, stop. That's just not valid. Number one, those people are going to have to relearn this stuff eventually. Two, why waste the time? Again, we are limited in numbers right now, all of us communists. We are limited in number and in influence. Even if we max out every possible usage of all the resources at our disposal, we're still going to fall short. And it's still going to take time to build that vanguard influence on the mass groups out there. I recognize that, and this isn't just impatience talking. What it is adding to the reality check a wake-up call and argument against the complacency that I see running through many of these otherwise positive comments. I think that there's a lot of implicit assumptions that this is the best we can do, and there's a sort of why even try harder because, it's going to be really hard and it's probably not going to amount. You got to overcome all of that. You've got to believe we can take a more active role and start closing the gap against the social democrats. Communism can be a well-loved ideology and political movement in this country, but tailing social democracy is not the way to make that happen. Yes, we have to change hearts and minds, but those hearts and minds are more ready than you think, many of them. All right, next comment. That's my view. Zohran's a good man working in a system that is fundamentally structured to preserve the interest of capital. He's still shifting the Overton window towards socialism. We've already discussed both of these points, that he's a good man. You don't know that. He's a politician, or he was a close personal friend or what. And as far as the Overton window, forget that, throw that out. Final comment. I think that the hope people feel either way is a good thing. Either Mamdani gets in there and is able to deliver on the goals he set out on, or he can't. What do you all think will happen if he can't? I do agree with some people already thinking, well, it depends on why he can't, right? Like, if it's because he's sold out, people will lose their faith in effort makes output. So commenting, yes, I agree. People will not understand the cause inherently. They won't understand necessarily on their own that liberalism is the problem. Socialism requires completely different tactics, strategy, and organizing. We need communists there to explain that. That is how people actually step forward. Continuing, people will fall back into the learned helplessness that's been choking the American people out for the past 70 or 80 years. I really agree with this. I think that learned helplessness, look it up, it's a concept in psychology, in which basically a subject in a situation where no matter what they do, nothing works, just gives up because they've learned that nothing works, is a valid concept here, because people try everything available within the system, nothing works, and they get really upset, frustrated, demoralized, and despite their objections to events unfolding around them, they give up and end up on the sidelines. Because the reasoning goes, why waste the energy when everything you have tried, and you've tried everything you can think of, does not result in what you need? This is where Vanguard communist leadership comes in to teach people how to go beyond the system, because it is not obvious. A lot of people will understand pieces of it intuitively, and when we talk to them, that's what we need to connect what we know with, as we bring them into a bigger picture view, a historical materialist view of the class struggle, their place in it, and what needs to be done. To do that well, it does require a systematic study. This is where communist parties, communist groups come in to help organize and guide the people toward the systematic struggle that has to be waged. Continuing the comment, but if he fails because the other capitalists, be they Democrat or Republican, have gotten in the way, people will only go left even further. Or I would say maybe people can be mobilized to intensify the struggle to fight back, and maybe change strategy and tactics as needed also. Again, role of communists here is critical. Anger will be the people's motivator, and day after day they will become more and more ready to remove anyone in the system that holds up economic leftist progress. Basically, it will inch the population toward revolution further faster, but that's just my opinion. And to this commenter, I would say read Reform or Revolution by Luxemburg, because actually she reaches a lot of the same conclusions, that reforms, the struggle for them, and the things that people learn in the course of that struggle are all steps along the road to revolution, which is the only way to continue to expand and to make permanent those reforms. Because while the capitalists still control society in the pre-revolutionary time, they can roll them back whenever they feel it's expedient for them to do so. But that, yes, while the reforms are really kind of a byproduct of the struggle, they are also important in helping to build that class consciousness. Anybody who's participated in any kind of campaign, whether it's for minimum wage or any other kind of rights, rent control, forming a union in your workplace, whatever, took many steps forward, grew by leaps and bounds because of what you experienced there, and then coupled with the studies that you're doing of the history of the international communist movement, you can link up what you experienced to what other organizers and revolutionaries before you have experienced and written about, as well as the underpinnings of capitalism and the theoretical reasons why the capitalist class behaves the way it does. In other words, the theory informs the practice and the practice informs the theory, because this is science, revolutionary social science, in which we make observations, form hypotheses, test them through experiment, revise our theories, and keep working forward to revolution. Continuing the comment, that's just my opinion. I could be 100% wrong, and I do want to hear what other people think. Not trying to spread misinformation, just sharing my opinion on the matter. End of comment. And let me tell you, commenter, that you have good instincts. Please go to the home tab at the Socialism for All YouTube page, then just scroll down slightly to the recommended reading list playlist section and start studying, because we need more communists. Alright, so that's it for the comments. Like I said, a lot of them were not truly awful, but there were certain worrying threads, a lot of which fall under that category of complacency and some opportunism. What I would really like here is, people can do whatever they want to with the Mamdani campaign, but do not fall under the spell, the siren song of social democracy and the Democratic Party, which is a 1% controlled, genocidal, imperialist political party which first took the White House in 1828. They are not the future, they are the past. This is their system. We need to move beyond it. And while as communists we always should take opportunities to agitate, including trying to pick up disaffected people who were liberals or social democrats and are starting to see through that, we absolutely need to try to reach those people. What I'm saying here, and what I'm really trying to emphasize, is we need now to work on getting ahead of the social democrats where they're tailing us. In other words, instead of the situation where everybody's getting this excited because Zohran Mamdani, maybe a sort of socialist, maybe, but running in the Democratic Party, won a major primary. Again, not the election, just the primary. What if we were doing that in a workers' party and in conjunction with the rebuilding of the labor movement led by communist groups? So that's the kind of situation we need to be trying to envision and figure out the steps between here and there. In the meantime, what is Mamdani's vision? Well, here's his platform from his website. It says, New York is too expensive. Zohran will lower costs and make life easier. Great. Under housing, we have freeze the rent, build affordable housing, including public housing, cracking down on bad landlords, supporting homeowners and ending deed theft. Under safety, establishing a Department of Community Safety, which it sounds like would replace some police officers with unarmed officers trained in crisis response. Under affordability, city-owned grocery stores, fast fare-free buses, fighting corporate exploitation, which is kind of a grab bag, talking about fighting misleading advertising, predatory contracts, hidden fees, non-compete clauses, and some other items. Under early childhood and education, no-cost childcare, baby baskets for New York's newborns, funding K-12 education as well as CUNY, the college system, taxing corporations and the 1%, creating green schools for a healthier New York, LGBTQIA+ protections. Under healthcare, sending out outreach workers to make sure that people are maximizing their benefit usage. Under labor, raising the minimum wage to $30 by 2030, regulating delivery apps and protecting delivery workers. Under small business, cutting bureaucracy and making it easier to start a small business. Funding libraries, and, quote, Trump-proofing New York City by making it an LGBTQIA+ sanctuary city, protecting reproductive rights, getting ICE out of all city facilities, and ending cooperation with ICE. And he does say any cooperation. You're going to have a struggle there, but that will be interesting to see for sure. And increasing the budgets of DCWP, the Department of Consumer and Worker Protection, and the New York City Commission on Human Rights. So that's what's on his agenda as far as the platform. Now let's take a look at a video that his campaign put out this week.
1 week ago, we shocked the establishment and redrew the political map with a campaign relentlessly focused on the needs of working people. Since then, a lot of people have asked me if I was surprised by the results. In some ways, I was. We always thought our victory would come after multiple rounds of ranked choice voting. So when we got more first-round votes than Eric Adams got in 7 rounds in the last election, it was astonishing. But in other ways, this was always the plan. We wanted to rebuild a coalition that had frayed over years of disappointment and neglect, to win people back to a Democratic Party that puts working people first.
All right, so I have to stop him here because the Democratic Party will never put working people first. In Marxism, we understand that political parties are the concentrated expression of a class point of view, and the Democratic Party represents a faction of the imperialist, advanced monopoly capitalist class. It is a ruling class party which again has been in power since the 1820s. Trying to make it put working people first is a losing proposition guaranteed to demoralize and scatter the people organizing under Mamdani. And yet this is what he is leading with. Either he doesn't know what he's doing, in which case he should not be leading, or he does know what he's doing, in which case you should not be following him. Real working class leadership would be guiding people out of the Democratic Party and into a socialist workers' party. Anyone who knows anything about U.S. politics over the last 50 or so years knows that entering the Democratic Party means losing whatever left politics you had. That is not going to suddenly change now. Now, in the next section of the video, I don't even know who the section is for, maybe poli-sci nerds of the Hill Rising variety, but I think there's a ton of really bad assumptions in this about how they flipped the vote and how they won. Let's watch.
So let's break it down. Last November, New York City saw some of the biggest shifts towards Donald Trump of anywhere in the country. Much of it took place in working class and immigrant neighborhoods. A few days after the election, we went to Hillside Avenue in Queens and Fordham Road in the Bronx, not to lecture, but to listen. And what we heard was a desire to bring down the cost of living. That was our focus, and many of those voters came back. Brighton Beach went for Trump by 44 points. Last week, we won it by 16. College Point was a plus 11 Trump neighborhood. We took it by 8 points. We saw similar or even bigger swings at Bath Beach, Astoria Heights, and the North Shore of Staten Island. The headline is clear. We can win back voters many have written off if we give them something to vote for, not just tell them what to be against. When Eric Adams eked out a win by 7,000 votes 4 years ago, he called it a mandate and pronounced himself the new face of the Democratic Party. Even then, it was a little ridiculous. But in some neighborhoods, he did put up impressive margins. Take Flatbush, for example. Eric Adams dominated there, double digits ahead of his next rival. On Tuesday, there was also a double-digit victory, except it was for us, over Andrew Cuomo. We flipped Crown Heights by 45 points, North Corona by 33, and Jamaica by a staggering 57 points. These are the outer borough voters that Eric Adams said he'd bring with him to City Hall. He served as donors instead. Whether we're talking about young voters, older voters, or just plain disaffected New Yorkers, no campaign in recent history has been as successful at driving new voter registrations, especially in the 100 days before the election. Just take a look at this graph. According to the Times, in the 14 days before the registration deadline, about 37,000 people registered to vote. That's over 10 times the number of new registrations over the same period of time in the 2021 mayoral primary. As a result, we won big with zero prime voters, New Yorkers who had not voted in any recent mayoral primary. For instance, in Gravesend, at least 32% of all voters were first-time primary voters. Most campaigns focus on triple primes, New Yorkers who voted in the last 3 primaries. But this strategy ignores most of our city, yet we knew that we could turn them out if they saw themselves in our policies. We ran a campaign that tried to talk to every New Yorker. Whether I could speak their language,
आपकी वजह से हमने $8 million रेज किया है, 6 लाख से ज़्यादा दरवाजे खटखटाए हैं,
or just tried.
que se comprometa al bienestar.
All the words are new! And the coalition that came out on Tuesday reflected the mosaic of these 5 boroughs. We won South Asian neighborhoods by huge margins in places like City Line, Ozone Park, Jamaica Hills. We won Latino neighborhoods like Corona, Washington Heights, Pelham Bay, and Woodhaven. We won many of the same Chinese voters that turned out for Trump in Flushing, Chinatown, and Bensonhurst. And in the final months of the campaign, we narrowed Andrew Cuomo's once sizable lead with black voters, outright winning young black New Yorkers and neighborhoods like Harlem and Flatbush. Andrew Cuomo and his super PAC spent more than $31 million. That's about $87 per vote. We were focused on affordability, and it cost us only $19 per vote. But what you did for us was worth so much more than what money could buy. The result? We shattered everyone's expectations, including our own. A Cuomo spokesperson put it best, saying they had not foreseen our ability to, quote, expand the electorate in such a way that no turnout model or poll was able to capture. Conventional wisdom says the left can only win low turnout elections. We rewrote the rule book by, get this, talking to New Yorkers. Politics in this city won't ever be the same, and it's all thanks to you. The next chapter begins today, New York.
Okay, and that's his video. So, to recap, New York City flipped to Trump in large numbers in 2020, especially immigrant and working class neighborhoods. Why? They wanted to bring down the cost of living. Why in the world you would vote for a Republican to bring down the cost of living is incredible to me, but it does show where a lot of people are at. So they say you can bring back voters if you give them something to vote for. This is elementary. A lot of politicians do this, not all, but can you deliver? Because if you promise them something and then don't deliver, they're not going to come out again. That happens a lot. Anyway, now we're getting really tangled up in the particulars of electoralism, which, to be clear, I really detest. That should be such an overall small part of your strategy, like 5 or 10% of your party's efforts. But for Democrats, it's everything, because they really believe in the government and the system. And they show a lot of charts about how neighborhoods that had gone for Eric Adams flipped to them, and I didn't really find the section that compelling. Okay, people who had tried something new in the last election also tried something new in this one. There were really no data to explain that. Remember, New York City is a complicated place, very multiracial place, multi-ethnic place. There's a lot of factors going into why people vote the way that they do and the relations between different groups in the city. I saw, a lot of boasting that they had won. I didn't really hear clear reasons why, except that they had driven a lot of new voter registration, so they signed up people and then directly sent them into this primary, end quote. We knew we could turn them out if they saw themselves in our policies, unquote. Okay, but any skilled campaign can trick people into thinking that it doesn't mean it's real. I just overall cannot stand Democratic Party pandering. Anyway, people are trying to draw a lot of conclusions from this. Again, I didn't hear a compelling narrative in here, really. There may be some compelling narrative, some thread tying together why exactly they won, but I wouldn't draw any conclusions off of this particular video. Also, something I probably underemphasized in the last video is he was running against one of the most hated, disgusting people, Andrew Cuomo. Yes, of course, the established imperialists really love him. He's been a reliable asset. He's one of them. But a lot of people don't like him, so I don't know how this would have gone in another race, and in another race where he didn't get cross endorsements from 2 other candidates. So, okay, you beat Cuomo, but let's hold off on sort of drawing grand conclusions at this point. I would like to see other data. And again, what is the purpose of this? Rehabilitating the Democratic Party, making it the kind of Democratic Party everybody can believe in. That's where this campaign is heading, according to the guy running it. I just really want you to sit with that, because that is a dead end. That's not going to happen. That's going to have bad fallout that we, opponents of the Democratic Party and of capitalism, are going to have to contend with. While we always have to contend with capitalism, I do not normally see people getting this excited about it. Hence, it's time for a reality check. So that said, I'd like to end this video by turning to the writings of Lenin from around the time 1900, when the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, social democracy at that time being what they called Marxism, this would later split into the Menshevik, what we would today call social democratic reformists, and the Bolshevik communist revolutionaries. But at this time, circa 1900, when the party was being set up, Lenin was engaged in a debate with a revisionist or anti-Marxist faction of the party, which eventually would become Menshevik, but at this time was known as Economism. And we're actually going to do a short audiobook from December 1901 titled A Talk with Defenders of Economism, and see what lessons we can get to apply to the current situation today. But as far as trying to establish a communist vanguard and pushing back on the kind of tendencies that we're seeing now, like the right wing of DSA, what are some lessons we can turn to? So first of all, some things that we already have on the channel. If you search on What is Class Struggle, it'll bring up a piece by Lenin from 1899 titled Articles for Rабочая Gazeta. It's a good set of articles as a whole. I would also particularly turn your attention to one titled Our Immediate Task. And of course, I will link these in the video description. Another one is The Urgent Tasks of Our Movement from 1900 by Lenin. Also, the Declaration of the Editorial Board of Iskra, ISKRA, from 1900. Where to Begin from 1901 by Lenin. And a major work from this time, you've probably heard the title before, What is to be Done by Lenin from 1902. And that is a 6.5-hour work, which brings together, develops, and expands a lot of the concepts in Lenin's articles from that time. Basically, there was a debate within the party at that time as to what its role and function was going to be and its relationship to the working class movement. The economists had more of an approach of tailing and documenting the spontaneous movement of the workers. However, Lenin advocated for a more proactive leading role of the party with relation to the movement. And that's the main topic of What is to be Done, which is included in a number of recommended reading lists, including the basic Marxism-Leninism study guide, which we have on the channel. It's almost finished. We're halfway through Capital Volume 1, which is the second to last, but we do have 24 other earlier pieces in there, including What is to be Done. And in that work, he talks about the limits of spontaneous working class consciousness, saying that the history of all countries shows that the working class, exclusively by its own effort, is only able to develop what he called trade union consciousness, or the struggle for better conditions within capitalism, and that it really takes a more advanced formal academic study of philosophy, history, economics, the history of the class struggle, all the different manifestations of political despotism and autocracy in order to wage a successful struggle against the whole system, and that was the role of the party, was to introduce to the workers this advanced study which would enable them to break out of the box, so to speak, rather than just trying to seek better comfort within it. He then went on to describe the certain attributes that the party should have in terms of policy and structure in order to maintain its ideological discipline and the proper amount of command centralization. So in other words, putting forward a vision of the party as the conscious vanguard of the working class, its brain, so to speak, which would take an active role in building the working class's consciousness, as distinct from the spontaneous expression of the struggle by the working class, spontaneity being consciousness in an embryonic or underdeveloped form which the party would help develop. And when I talked earlier in this video about the vanguard, the party, the communist vanguard being the key ingredient, and it has to be organized properly, but then once it exists, it is that key ingredient which can take that mass spontaneous struggle and prevent it once it has risen up in response to some injustice. For example, a recent example was the 2020 nationwide BLM protests, and before that, Occupy Wall Street. Or let's say that there is a wave of labor strikes. Whatever it is, the masses do rise up spontaneously from time to time. However, without an organized communist vanguard to help direct them into a sustained struggle for the big picture, history shows that they tend to just dissolve back into disorganized activity and liberalism, and again, trade union consciousness. This is basically where we are now, as a communist vanguard has yet to fully really establish itself in the US and to form a close bond with the working class movement. I would say that that's underway, but in the meantime, we can expect, again, more of the same frustrating dissolution between uprisings. Again, the communist vanguard, organized as the party, is what keeps it moving forward and prevents it from falling apart between uprisings, instead encouraging reflection and study and growth and strategy and improving tactics and so on. Lenin then expanded on these points in later works like 1904's One Step Forward, Two Steps Back, which we don't have on the channel, and 1917's The State and Revolution, and 1920's Left-Wing Communism and Infantile Disorder, which we do. He expands on the role of the party and its functioning in those works. And as we say, Marxism-Leninism is Marxism updated to the era of imperialism or advanced monopoly capitalism, which emerged after Marx's time, and proletarian revolutions once socialism was beginning to be built. And as such, Lenin's statements that the class does not even really become a class capable of acting in its own interest until it gets the party, which represents and carries forward its conscious vision of its own interests. This is an updating of Marx and Engels' class in itself, which is a group of people sharing common material conditions, specifically when we talk about class, the relationship to the means of production, to the class for itself, which is the class which is aware of these commonalities, the shared conditions, the shared exploitation. There are bonds of solidarity developed and then organizing to abolish private property, meaning bourgeois property or capitalist property, which is distinct from personal property, so like not your clothes and things like that, but the productive workplaces and other shared infrastructure of society. So those are some recommended readings. Highly recommend What Is to Be Done, and if you're going to do that, you might as well go through the basic Marxism-Leninism study guide. For now, let's do a new reading, not previously featured on the channel, from December 6, 1901, published in Iskra, which was the newspaper that Lenin headed. It means the spark. And it's a talk with Defenders of Economism, thanks to the Marxists Internet Archive, Marxists.org, for hosting this and thousands of other free Marxist texts. You can also look at sites like Mao.com to read along or to find texts that we haven't done as audiobooks yet. So let's begin. Lenin starts by saying below we publish in full, as received from one of our representatives, quote, a letter to the Russian Social Democratic Press. In response to the suggestion made by our comrades in exile that we express our views on Iskra, we have resolved to state the reasons for our disagreement with that organ or newspaper. While recognizing that the appearance of a special Marxist organ specially devoted to questions of the political struggle is entirely opportune, we do not think that Iskra, which has undertaken this task, has performed it satisfactorily. So, we need this thing, we just don't like the way you're doing it. The principal drawback of the paper, which runs like a scarlet thread through its columns, and which is the cause of all its other defects, large and small, is the exaggerated importance it attaches to the influence which the ideologists of the movement exert upon its various tendencies. So exactly what I was saying before about the communist vanguard is necessary, otherwise the movement is going to keep dissolving between uprisings and will never form a sustained structure that will be ultimately successful against capitalism. That's what they have an issue with. Continuing. At the same time, Iskra gives too little consideration to the material elements and the material environment of the movement, whose interaction creates a definite type of labor movement and determines its path. The path from which the ideologists, despite all their efforts, are incapable of diverting it, even if they're inspired by the finest theories and programs. So they're saying that, no matter what you say to the movement, they're just limited by circumstance and they're just going to wind up doing the same things. It's a very deterministic type of thing. However, we know that the objective conditions play a role. That's the societal conditions, but also the subjective class consciousness of the workers in the movement. That also is crucially important. Without that, you can't have a revolution. Continuing, this defect becomes most marked when Iskra is compared with Yuzhny Rabochi, another Marxist newspaper, which, like Iskra, raises the banner of political struggle, but connects it with the preceding phase of the South Russian working class movement. Such a presentation of the question is alien to Iskra. It has set itself the task of fanning the spark, which is what Iskra means, into a great conflagration, but it forgets that necessary inflammable material and favorable environmental conditions are required for such a task. In dissociating itself completely from the economists, Iskra loses sight of the fact that their activity prepared the ground for the workers' participation in the February and March events, upon which Iskra lays so much stress, and to all appearances greatly exaggerates. While criticizing adversely the activity of the Social Democrats or Marxists of the late 1890s, Iskra ignores the fact that at the time the conditions were lacking for any work other than the struggle for minor demands, and ignores also the enormous educational significance of that struggle. Iskra is entirely wrong and unhistorical in its appraisement of that period, and of the direction of the activities of the Russian Marxists at that time in identifying their tactics with those of Zubetov, the colonel of the gendarmes who tried to introduce quote-unquote police socialism, who set up fake workers' organizations under the protection of the gendarmerie and police in an effort to divert workers away from the revolutionary movement. And Iskra is also wrong in failing to differentiate between the struggle for minor demands, which widens and deepens the labor movement, and minor concessions, whose purpose was to paralyze every struggle and every movement. So they're saying, look, you got it wrong, you're drawing the wrong historical conclusions, you're exaggerating the importance of this, really the workers couldn't have done anything else at the time, and the lack of a vanguard is really not the key piece here. Anyway, they continue. Thoroughly imbued with the sectarian intolerance, so characteristic of ideologists in the infantile period of social movements, Iskra is ready to brand every disagreement with it not only as a departure from Marxist principles, but as desertion to the camp of the enemy. Of such a nature is its extremely indecent and most reprehensible attack upon another newspaper, Robochaya Misl, contained in the article on Zubetov, in which the latter's success among a certain section of the working class was attributed to that publication. Negatively disposed to other Marxist organizations which differ from it in their views on the progress and the tasks of the Russian labor movement, Iskra, in the heat of controversy, at times forgets the truth, and, picking on isolated, unfortunate expressions, attributes to its opponents views they do not hold, emphasizes points of disagreement that are frequently of little material importance, and obstinately ignores the numerous points of contact in views. We have in mind Iskra's attitude toward Robochaya Dielo. So basically they're saying, look, Iskra, Lenin at the head of that paper, we mostly agree. We don't have fundamental differences. The things that you're seizing on, nitpicking and blowing up are really unimportant distinctions where they're not just flat wrong in the first place and don't actually exist. And you're not playing nice with these other newspapers. You're being overly critical of them and hostile. Continuing, Iskra's excessive predilection for controversy is due primarily to its exaggerating the role of ideology, programs, theories, etc. in the movement, and it is partly an echo of the internecine or infighting squabbles that have flared up among Russian political exiles in Western Europe, of which they have hastened to inform the world in a number of polemical pamphlets and articles. In our opinion, these disagreements exercise almost no influence upon the actual course of the Russian Marxist movement, except perhaps to damage it by bringing an undesirable schism or split into the midst of comrades working in Russia. For this reason, we cannot but express our disapproval of Iskra's fervent polemics, particularly when it oversteps the bounds of decency. So basically they're saying, look, you exiles from Russia currently living in Europe, you're writing in these newspapers all this kind of infighting, it's actually just bugging people, serving no constructive purpose, and not really having any effect anyway, so cut it out. Continuing, this basic drawback of Iskra is also the cause of its inconsistency on the question of the attitude of social democracy to the various social classes and tendencies. By theoretical reasoning, Iskra solved the problem of the immediate transition to the struggle against absolutism. So commenting, remember at this time, Russia was behind a lot of Europe, it had some capitalism, but it had not developed to the point where it had fully overthrown the old feudal order or the remnants of it. So Russia still had an absolute monarchy, a czar, and it didn't even yet have an advisory parliament or congress. That would come as a result of the 1905 revolution. So that's what they're talking about there. Continuing, in all probability it senses the difficulty of such a task for the workers under the present state of affairs, but lacking the patience to wait until the workers will have gathered sufficient forces for the struggle, Iskra begins to seek allies in the ranks of the liberals and intellectuals. In other words, in the fight against Tsarism. Continuing, in this quest, it not infrequently departs from the class point of view, obscures class antagonisms, and puts into the forefront the common nature of the discontent with the government, although the causes and the degree of the discontent vary considerably among the, quote, allies. Such, for example, is Iskra's attitude toward the Zemstvo, which was a kind of local government in Russia. It tries to fan into flames of political struggle the Zemstvos Frondian demonstrations, the Fronde being a series of civil wars in France in the mid-17th century, which are frequently called forth by the fact that the government pays more attention to the protection of industry than to the agrarian aspirations of the Zemstvo gentry. Lenin's reference is to the liberal landlords, the members of the Zemstvo boards. And it promises the nobles who are dissatisfied with the government's sops the assistance of the working class, but it doesn't say a word about the class antagonism that exists between these social strata. It may be conceded that it is admissible to say that the Zemstvo is being roused, and that it is an element fighting the government, but this must be stated so clearly and distinctly that no doubt will be left as to the character of a possible agreement with such elements. Iskra, however, approaches the question of our attitude toward the Zemstvo in a way that to our mind can only dim class consciousness. For in this matter, like the advocates of liberalism and of the various cultural endeavors, Iskra goes against the fundamental task of Marxist literature, which is not to obscure class antagonism, but to criticize the bourgeois system and explain the class interests that divide it. Such, too, is Iskra's attitude toward the student movement. And yet in other articles, Iskra sharply condemns all, quote, compromise and defends, for instance, the intolerant conduct of the Gezdists, French socialists, followers of Jules Guesde. So now they're going on the attack, saying that Iskra and Lenin are bad theorists as well, instead of waiting for just workers. And remember, Russia at that time had very underdeveloped capitalism, so the proletariat was small, very much unlike, say, the United States today. And they start criticizing Lenin for finding a role against the Tsar of certain liberals, basically the somewhat obvious step of using the liberals to help bring down the Tsarist government, then organizing against the liberals and capitalism before they have a chance to set up, which is exactly what Russia did, and it worked. Concluding, we shall refrain from dwelling upon Iskra's minor defects and blunders, but in conclusion, we think it our duty to observe that we do not in the least desire by our criticism to belittle the significance which Iskra can acquire, nor do we close our eyes to its merits. We welcome it as a political Marxist newspaper in Russia. We regard one of its greatest merits to be its able explanation of the question of terror, to which it devoted a number of timely articles. Comment, Marxism is opposed to terrorism, which it regards as adventurist, or a petty bourgeois strategy which gets ahead of the overall working class movement and is not effective. Continuing, finally, we cannot refrain from noting the exemplary literary style in which Iskra is written, a thing so rare in illegal publications, its regular appearance, and the abundance of fresh and interesting material which it publishes. Signed, a group of comrades, September 1901. So that's the end of the letter that Lenin is going to now respond to. In the first place, we should like to say that we cordially welcome the straightforwardness and frankness of the authors of this letter. It is high time to stop playing at hide and seek, concealing one's economist credo, as is done by a section of the Odessa Committee from which the politicians broke away, or declaring, as if in mockery of the truth, that at the present time, quote, not a single Marxist organization is guilty of the sin of economism, as was published in Robochye Dielo. And now to the matter. The authors of the letter fall into the very same fundamental error as that made by Robochye Dielo, particularly issue number 10. They are muddled over the question of the relations between the, quote, material, or spontaneous, as Robochye Dielo put it, elements of the movement, and the ideological, or conscious, operating according to plan elements. They fail to understand that the, quote, ideologist is worthy of the name only when they precede the spontaneous movement, point out the road, and are able ahead of all others to solve all the theoretical, political, tactical, and organizational questions which the material elements of the movement spontaneously encounter. In order truly to give, quote, consideration to the material elements of the movement, one must view them critically. One must be able to point out the dangers and defects of spontaneity and to elevate it to the level of consciousness. To say, however, that ideologists, which is to say politically conscious leaders, cannot divert the movement from the path determined by the interaction of environment and elements is to ignore the simple truth that the conscious element participates in this interaction and in the determination of the path. Catholic and monarchist labor unions in Europe are also an inevitable result of the interaction of environment and elements, but it was the consciousness of priests and Zubatovs, and not that of socialists, that participated in this interaction. The theoretical views of the authors of this letter, like those of Robochye Dielo, do not represent Marxism, but that parody of it which is nursed by our, quote, critics and Bernsteinians. Bernstein was a noted revisionist. And actually, if you read Rosa Luxemburg's Reform or Revolution, which I recommended before, and I'm recommending again, a lot of it is written against him, who are unable to connect spontaneous evolution with conscious revolutionary activity. And commenting, that's exactly what we're talking about, connecting the spontaneous movement with conscious revolutionary activity. So you can go into a strike or an uprising of some kind. If you have a religious consciousness, if you have a liberal consciousness, that's going to have one outcome. You're going to behave in a certain way. But if those workers have in their heads a communist consciousness, that's going to result in different actions. So it's that subjective factor, the workers' consciousness, that the party is there to help build up and create a communist consciousness. Continuing, in the prevailing circumstances of today, this profound theoretical error inevitably leads to a great tactical error, which has brought incalculable damage to Russian Marxism. It is a fact that the spontaneous awakening of the masses of the workers, and due to their influence of other social strata, it spills over from the workers to other classes, has been taking place with astonishing rapidity during the past few years. The, quote, material elements of the movement have grown enormously even as compared with 1898, 3 years prior. But the conscious leaders, the Marxists, lag behind this growth. This is the main cause of the crisis which Russian Marxism is now experiencing. The mass spontaneous movement lacks, quote, ideologists sufficiently trained theoretically to be proof against all vacillations, hesitations, or switching sides, lack of commitment. It lacks leaders with such a broad political outlook, such revolutionary energy, and such organizational talent as to create a militant political party on the basis of the new movement. All this in itself would, however, be but half the evil. Theoretical knowledge, political experience, and organizing ability are things that can be acquired, if only the desire exists to study and acquire these qualities. But since the end of 1897, particularly since the autumn of 1898, there have come forward in the Russian Marxist movement individuals and periodicals that not only close their eyes to this drawback, but that have declared it to be a special virtue, that have elevated the worship of and servility toward spontaneity to the dignity of a theory, and are preaching that Marxists must not march ahead of the movement, but should drag along at the tail end. We call this tailism today. These periodicals include not only Robochia Missile, but also Robochie Dielo, which began with the, quote, stages theory, and ended with the defense, as a matter of principle, of spontaneity, of the, quote, full rights of the movement of the moment, of, quote, tactics as process, etc. This indeed was a sad situation. It meant the emergence of a separate trend, which is usually designated as economism, in the broad sense of the word, the principal feature of which is its incomprehension and even defense of lagging, i.e., as we have explained, the lagging of the conscious leaders behind the spontaneous awakening of the masses. The characteristic features of this trend express themselves in the following: with respect to principles, in a vulgarization of Marxism, and in helplessness in the face of modern, quote, criticism, that up-to-date species of opportunism. And commenting, opportunism in the Marxist sense tends to be working with parties with whom you have fundamental disagreements, so like proletarian class collaboration with the bourgeoisie. An example in our day is leftists getting involved with the Democratic Party. May seem easy, but you're going to become their tool. Continuing, with respect to politics, in the striving to restrict political agitation and political struggle, or reduce them to petty activities, in the failure to understand that unless Marxists take the leadership of the general democratic movement in their own hands, democratic here meaning the movement against autocracy and the czar, they will never be able to overthrow the autocracy. With respect to tactics, in utter instability. Last spring, Robochie Dielo stood in amazement before the, quote, new question of terror, and only 6 months later, after considerable wavering and, as always, dragging along at the tail end of the movement, did it express itself against terror in a very ambiguous resolution. And with respect to organization, in the failure to understand that the mass character of the movement does not diminish, but increases our obligation to establish a strong and centralized organization of revolutionaries who are capable of leading the preparatory struggle, every unexpected outbreak, and finally, the decisive assault. Against this trend, we have conducted and will continue to conduct an irreconcilable struggle. The authors of this letter apparently belong to this trend. They tell us that the economic struggle prepared the ground for the workers' participation in the demonstrations. True enough, but we appreciated sooner and more profoundly than all others the importance of this preparation when, as early as December 1900, in our first issue, we opposed the stages theory, and when, in February, in our second issue, immediately after the drafting of the students into the army and prior to the demonstrations, we called upon the workers to come to the aid of the students. The February and March events did not, quote, refute the fears and alarms of Iskra, as Martinov, who thereby displays his utter failure to understand the question, thinks, as expressed in Рабочее дело number 10, but wholly confirmed them, for the leaders lagged behind the spontaneous rise of the masses and proved to be unprepared for the fulfillment of their duties as leaders. Even at the present time, the preparations are far from adequate, and for that reason, all talk about exaggerating the role of ideology or the role of the conscious element as compared with the spontaneous element, etc., continues to exercise a most baneful, harmful influence upon our party. No less harmful is the influence exerted by the talk, allegedly in defense of the class point of view, about the need to lay less stress on the general character of discontent manifested by the various strata of the population against the government. On the contrary, we're proud of the fact that Iskra rouses political discontent among all strata of the population, and the only thing we regret is that we are unable to do this on a much wider scale. It is not true to say that in doing so we obscure the class point of view. The authors of the letter have not pointed to a single concrete instance in evidence of this, nor can they do so. Marxism, as the vanguard in the struggle for democracy, must, notwithstanding the opinion expressed in Рабочее дело number 10, lead the activities of the various oppositional strata, explain to them the general political significance of their partial and professional conflicts with the government, rally them to the support of the Revolutionary Party, and train from its own ranks leaders capable of exercising political influence upon all oppositional strata. Any renunciation of this function, however florid the phrases about close organic contact with the proletarian struggle, etc., with which it may deck itself, is tantamount to a fresh defense of lagging. The defense of lagging behind the nationwide democratic movement on the part of Marxists. It is tantamount to a surrender of the leadership to bourgeois democracy. So basically, Lenin is saying we're not in an immediate struggle for a socialist revolution. They're trying to take down the Tsar. That was the focus of the country as a whole. And really, the bourgeoisie were the ones next in line to benefit from that. But Lenin's saying don't let them take leadership. Even though it's the historic task in the course of development for capitalists to tear down the last of the feudal order, if we don't want the capitalists getting too entrenched and ahead of us, we should be in control of them from the start. Then, when the time comes and we need to overthrow them, we will be ready to do so. Continuing, let the authors of this letter ponder over the question as to why the events of last spring served so strongly to stimulate non-Marxist revolutionary tendencies, instead of raising the authority and prestige of Marxism. So that's key right here. In the United States today, we're dealing with a situation where Marxism is not very prestigious. It's not held in very high regard, and we have to establish some kind of a basis for that. We have to earn people's trust and respect. How do you do that? Providing leadership, solving questions, not just letting the same old liberals and SOCDEMs run people in circles, wasting time while Donald Trump and the Republican Party gain strength. Continuing, nor can we refrain from protesting against the astonishing short-sightedness displayed by the authors of the letter in regard to the controversies and internecine squabbles among the political exiles. They repeat the stale nonsense about the, quote, indecency of devoting to Рабочая мысль an article on Zubetov. Do they wish to deny that the spreading of economism facilitates the tasks of the Zubetovs? In asserting this, however, we do not in the slightest identify as such the tactics of the economists with those of Zubetov. They just kind of help him out. As for the, quote, political exiles, if the authors of the letter were not so unpardonably careless concerning the continuity of ideas in the Russian Marxist movement, they would have known that the warning about economism sounded by the, quote, political exiles, or to be precise, by the Emancipation of Labor group, has been strikingly confirmed. Note the manner in which Lassalle, who was active among the Rhine workers in 1852, judged the controversies of the exiles in London. Writing to Marx, he said, quote, "The publication of your work against the big men, Kinkel, Ruge, etc., should hardly meet with any difficulties on the part of the police. For in my opinion, the government is not averse to the publication of such works because it thinks that the, quote, revolutionaries will cut one another's throats. Their bureaucratic logic neither suspects nor fears the fact that it is precisely internal party struggles that lend a party strength and vitality." Commenting, in other words, that constructive criticism is key to how communists improve. Like any scientists, continuing that the greatest proof of a party's weakness is its diffuseness and the blurring of clear demarcations, and that a party becomes stronger by purging itself. That's quoting the letter from Lassalle to Marx, June 24, 1852. Let the numerous complacent opponents of severity, irreconcilability, and fervent polemics, etc., take note. In other words, if you're a Marxist who is averse to criticism and just wants everybody to get along even when they should be criticizing each other, you're doing it wrong. In conclusion, we shall observe that in these remarks we have been able to deal only briefly with the questions in dispute. We intend to devote a special pamphlet to the analysis of these questions, which we hope will appear in the course of 6 weeks. And that's the end, and I believe he's referring there to what is to be done. Nice segue there for you to, again, go read that. As a closing note, I hope this has been helpful. It has been put forward in the spirit of trying to improve the movement and not being complacent. I hope that the audiobook here at the end was also helpful, as I hope that the other audiobooks, which I mentioned and which are again linked in the description, will be helpful when you're going through the real particulars of like, this newspaper said that, kind of like the YouTube channels of yesterday. And this one said that and this one was too mean. It can get a little dry when you get into the nitty-gritty of that. But there's also times in What Is to Be Done, just whole sections where there's this incredibly clarifying theory that Lenin will lay down, and you just go, wow, that explains so much, because capitalism and the politics of capitalism have not really changed since that time, substantially. The basic classes still exist, and so the basic political interests still exist. Trends and styles have changed, but again, the basic class perspectives really have not. So a lot of people find it shocking how applicable stuff from 100 years ago still is. People often say things like, wow, Lenin was a time traveler. And I say, no, Lenin was actually just living in the same historical moment that we are. He hasn't traveled time. Time has not moved forward. As a final note, though, if you are looking for something a bit more up-to-date, I recommend the works of Enver Hoxha of Albania, who continued a strong anti-revisionist trend into the later 20th century. His name is spelled Hoxha. We have a playlist as well as probably a dozen individual audiobooks, and in addition to the ones that we do have as audiobooks, on the particular topic that we covered in this video of socialism versus social democracy, I'd recommend Hoxha's book, Eurocommunism is Anti-Communism. With that, I'm going to sign out. Thanks for listening, and we will see you in the next video.